Meet my loser sister. She digs ditches for pennies, and my brother shouted in front of hundreds of elites. My mother just smiled in agreement. They didn't know I was the CEO of a $12 million empire, and my successful brother had just signed his own warrant by stealing the last cent from a sick father. Today, his house of cards falls right here at this banquet. My brother's voice sliced through the ballroom like a dull blade through soft wax. This is my little sister, everyone. No real career, no future to speak of. Just a laborer who spends her days in the mud. 200 guests in bespoke suits turned as one. Champagne flutes paused mid-air. Someone actually gasped. I stood there in my best dark denim and a silk blouse I'd bought specifically for the occasion, feeling the heat crawl up my neck as a ripple of polite, condescending laughter moved through the crowd. Julian raised his glass, a smug grin plastered across his face. This was his night, a celebration for a massive merger, and he was doing it in front of every power player in Denver. The worst part wasn't his arrogance. It was my mother. She didn't flinch. She just wore that tight, thin smile she always used when Juliana put me in my place. It was the look of someone who agreed but was too refined to say the words herself. Let's set the record straight. My name is June Miller. I'm 34 years old. According to my family, I'm the disappointment who digs ditches for a paycheck. What they don't know is that I am the founder and CEO of Bloom and Stone Landscape Architecture. I have 50 employees across the Mountain West. Last year, we cleared $12 million in revenue. This year, we just broke ground on a $5 million contract with the city for the downtown riverfront restoration. My work has been featured in Architectural Digest twice. We took home a National Design Award for the High Plains Park project. But to them, I'm just their stinky sister playing in the dirt. I never told them about the money, the awards, or the fact that my weekly payroll alone is nearly $50,000. I suppose I held onto this naive hope that they would eventually see me for who I am without a price tag attached to my name. I wanted them to love their daughter and sister without needing to see a balance sheet first. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Julian is 38, for years my senior and 4 centuries more entitled. He works in private equity, which in our family is the equivalent of walking on water. My mother has been calling him her a success story since his first internship at 22. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every casual Sunday phone call eventually circles back to Julian's latest promotion, Julian's new Porsche, Julian's high-profile clients. And me? Oh, June is still doing her little gardening thing, Mom would say. It isn't gardening, Mom. I've said it at least 1,000 times. I'm a licensed landscape architect. I design complex outdoor ecosystems, manage multi-million-dollar construction budgets, and run a firm with a fleet of heavy equipment worth more than Julian's house. That's nice, honey, she'd reply. But when are you going to get a real job? You know, something indoors where you don't get so dusty? I stopped trying to explain years ago. Some battles aren't worth the breath. Or so I thought. Julian had called me 3 weeks before this merger gala. He said he wanted me there, which should have been my first warning. Julian never wants me anywhere. I'm the embarrassing relative he pretends doesn't exist when he's networking. His exact words were a masterpiece of condescension. Listen, June, this is a massive night for me. Serious people will be there. So, maybe don't talk too much about your little lawn mowing business, okay? I don't need you making me look bad. I should have said no. I should have told him exactly where he could shove his invitation. But I have one fatal flaw. I actually love my brother. Somewhere beneath the layers of ego is the boy I used to build forts with. The teenager who taught me how to drive in an empty parking lot. The person I thought would always have my back. So I said yes, because apparently I'm a glutton for punishment. I spent 3 days agonizing over an outfit. Nothing too fancy, or Julian would mock me for trying too hard. Nothing too casual, or I'd be the slob who couldn't dress for a gala. I settled on dark jeans, a cream silk blouse, and the one pair of heels that didn't make me want to cry after 20 minutes. When I walked into that ballroom, I actually felt a flicker of hope. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe Julian would introduce me properly, and I could have a normal conversation with people who didn't already assume I was a failure. Then I saw the venue, and I nearly laughed. The Peaks Regency Hotel. Specifically, the newly renovated terrace and sustainable gardens of the Peaks Regency. I knew every inch of it. My company had designed and built the entire thing. We'd finished the project 14 months ago. There's a bronze plaque by the custom limestone fountain with our firm's name on it, Bloom and Stone. My brother had walked past it a dozen times tonight without a second glance. I grabbed a glass of champagne and tried to find a quiet corner to disappear into. That was when I saw my mother making her grand entrance, gravitating toward Julian like a moth to a flame. She hugged him for a solid 30 seconds. When she finally spotted me, I got a brief wave and a look that clearly said, "Don't cause any trouble tonight." "Hi, Mom. I'm doing great, thanks for asking." I was mentally calculating my escape when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to find Todd Halloway, my ex-boyfriend. The man who dumped me 8 years ago because I was, and I quote, going nowhere with that little lawnmower hobby. The man who told me I lacked ambition. He'd clearly had a hair transplant since I last saw him. It looked like a small, startled animal had been glued to his forehead. "June," he said, acting as if we were old friends. "Why, you look exactly the same." "Thank you, Todd. You are different. Very different. Especially the hairline." He didn't catch the sarcasm. He never did. It turned out Todd was one of Julian's potential investors. Of course he was. This night was shaping up to be a perfect storm of misery. Before I could excuse myself, Julian clinked his glass to command the room. He pulled me toward him with one arm, a fake, plastic smile plastered across his face. And then he said it. "Everyone, I want you to meet my family. This is my beautiful wife, Vanessa. My wonderful mother, Martha. And this is my stinky sister. No real job, no future. Just a manual laborer." The room erupted. My mother smiled. Todd actually snorted champagne through his nose, the only satisfying moment of the entire evening. I stood there frozen, wondering how I'd spent 34 years loving people who couldn't even pretend to respect me. But here's the thing about being underestimated. You learn how to watch. You learn how to wait. And you notice things that everyone else misses. I noticed the way Julian kept checking his phone with a flicker of panic. I saw that his smile never reached his eyes. I saw him drain 3 glasses of champagne in 20 minutes. Something was wrong. An older gentleman in the corner noticed it, too. He wasn't laughing at Julian's joke. He was watching my brother with the focused intensity of a hawk. Our eyes met across the room, and he raised his glass to me, just an inch. I had no idea who he was, but I was about to find out. But yes, let's definitely spend more time discussing Julian's bespoke suit. I was already mentally mapping out an exit strategy when I felt a firm tap on my shoulder. I turned to find Todd Holloway standing there. My ex. The man who had walked out on me 8 years ago because I was, in his words, going nowhere with that little lawn-mowing hobby. The man who had looked me in the eye and told me I lacked the ambition to ever amount to anything. He had clearly undergone a hair transplant since our last encounter. It looked as though a small, startled animal had been surgically attached to his forehead, yet somehow I was the one who had supposedly let myself go. June, he said, wearing an expression that suggested we were old friends rather than exes who hadn't spoken in a decade. Why, you look exactly the same. Thank you, Todd. You are different. Quite different. It's a very bold new hairline. He didn't catch the edge in my voice. He never did. It turned out Todd was one of Julian's prospective investors, because of course he was. This night was a disaster carefully curated to test my sanity. Before I could invent an excuse to flee, Julian clinked his glass and summoned the room to attention. He hooked an arm around my shoulders, pulling me into his orbit. With that practiced, hollow smile, he delivered the killing blow. Everyone, I'd like you to meet my family. This is my beautiful wife, Vanessa. My wonderful mother, Martha. And this is my sister, June. No real career, no future to speak of. Just a manual laborer who likes to play in the dirt. The room erupted in a wave of polite, cruel laughter. My mother's smile didn't waver. Todd actually snorted champagne through his nose, the only moment of the night that brought me a flicker of genuine joy. I stood there, paralyzed, wondering how I had spent 34 years of my life loving people who couldn't even manage a baseline of respect for me. But there is a specific advantage to being underestimated. You learn how to observe. You learn how to wait. And you begin to notice the cracks that everyone else is too busy ignoring. I watched the way Julian's thumb twitched against his glass. I saw the way he checked his phone with a flicker of barely concealed dread every few minutes. He had drained 3 glasses of champagne in under half an hour. Something was fundamentally wrong. I wasn't the only one who saw it. An older gentleman in the far corner was watching my brother with the focused, predatory stillness of a hawk. He wasn't laughing at the joke. When our eyes met, he offered a nearly imperceptible nod and raised his glass. I didn't know his name yet, but the air around him smelled like old money and quiet power. The party surged on around me. To these 200 strangers, Julian's joke was already forgotten, just another bit of social theatre. But I could still feel the weight of it in my chest, that familiar, heavy cloak of being the family failure. Vanessa materialized at my side like a designer-clad vampire sensing a wound. My sister-in-law had spent years perfecting the art of the backhanded compliment. "Oh, June," she cooed, her eyes scanning my outfit with clinical disapproval. "You couldn't find anything nicer? I mean, it's fine for you. Very practical." Vanessa was wearing a gown that likely cost more than my first work truck. Her blonde hair was pinned into a structural masterpiece that surely required a team of professionals and 3 hours of labor. She looked like a cover model for a magazine titled Women Who Married for the Portfolio. "Thanks, Vanessa. I love your dress, too. It looks very snug." She couldn't tell if I was being sincere or biting. Vanessa could never quite read me, which I considered one of my few personal victories in this family. The next hour was a masterclass in social endurance. Todd kept reappearing like a recurring nightmare, offering condescending advice on how I should consider a career change before I aged out of the workforce. My mother cornered me twice, not to check on me, but to remind me that Julian was under a lot of pressure and that I should be supportive instead of sulking. Julian, meanwhile, paraded through the room with the frantic energy of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. His investor presentation was flashy, all high-res renders and buzzwords, but it was hollow. He made grand promises about a disruptive growth and the unparalleled synergy, but the actual data was nowhere to be found. I know business. You don't scale a company to 12 million in revenue without learning how to read a room, and this room was starting to read Julian as a man who was selling far too hard. That was when I saw my father. He was sitting in a high-backed chair near the window, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. When had he become so frail? He was only 72, a man who had spent his life as a master electrician, strong, capable, and steady. Now, he looked tired and deeply confused. His suit, a fine wool blend, hung off his frame as if it belonged to a much larger man. My mother was standing over him, speaking in that sharp, hushed whisper she reserved for when he was being difficult. Dad just nodded, his eyes distant, not truly engaging with the world around him. I started toward them, my heart aching, but Julian intercepted me. Not now, he hissed, his hand tightening on my arm. Dad's fine. Don't go over there and make a scene. I'm not making a scene, Julian. I want to say hello to our father. Later. I need you to mingle. Todd thinks you might be a decent lead for some of his lower-tier clients. You know, small residential stuff. It would be good for your resume to have some professional associations. I own a corporation, Julian. I have a resume. It's doing just fine. He waved a hand dismissively, already looking over my shoulder for someone more useful. You know what I mean. Real experience. Come on, don't be difficult. I let him lead me away, mostly because I was too stunned to fight back in that moment. Lower-tier clients. My firm had just completed the landscaping for the governor's summer estate. But in Julian's world, I was still the girl with a shovel and a dream that he refused to acknowledge. I'm not making a scene, Julian. I want to say hello to our father. Later. I need you to mingle. Todd thinks you might be a decent lead for some of his lower-tier clients. You know, entry-level residential work. It would be good for your resume to have some professional associations. I own a corporation, Julian. I have a resume. It's doing just fine. He waved a hand dismissively, already looking over my shoulder for someone more useful. You know what I mean. Real experience. Come on, don't be difficult. I let him lead me away, mostly because I was too stunned to fight back in that moment. Todd was waiting for us with that hair transplant smile. He launched into a monologue about his investment philosophy while I mentally calculated exactly how many of his portfolios I could buy outright. The answer was most of them. You know, June, he said, leaning in as if sharing a profound secret. I always knew you had potential. You just needed direction. If you'd stayed with me, I could have helped you become someone. I became someone without you, Todd. That was rather the point. He laughed as if I'd told a charming joke. That was always your problem. No sense of what you could achieve with the right guidance. I was about to tell him exactly where he could stow his guidance when I heard Vanessa's voice rise above the ambient noise of the room. She was holding court with a group of women near the bar, and she wasn't being quiet about it. Oh, June? She's sweet. Really? A bit simple, of course. She digs ditches for a living. I keep telling Julian he should help her find a real career path, but you know how family is. You can't choose them. The women laughed, that polite, hollow social laughter that agrees without committing. My mother was in that circle. She didn't laugh, but she didn't defend me either. She simply sipped her wine and stood at the ceiling as if the molding were the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. Something inside me cracked. It didn't break, I've had too much practice for that, but it cracked like ice on a lake just before it gives way. I needed air. I slipped out onto the terrace. My terrace. The one my firm had designed. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of the night-blooming jasmine we'd planted in the raised steel beds. Everything out here was my vision, my success, my hard-earned reality. And not a single person inside had the slightest clue. That was when the older gentleman from earlier stepped through the glass doors. He was tall, likely in his late 60s, with silver hair and the kind of expensive, casual attire that signaled he no longer had anything to prove. His watch likely cost more than my first 3 years of business earnings combined. "Beautiful work out here," he said, nodding toward the garden beds. "The water feature especially. It's a very sophisticated design." "Thank you." He smiled. "You did it, didn't you? This terrace." I recognized the signature style from the High Plains Park restoration. I blinked at him, caught off guard. "How do you know about High Plains?" "Because I read, and because your project won a National Design Award last year." There was a very insightful profile in Architectural Digest. June Miller, founder of Bloom and Stone. He extended a hand. "Warren Beckford." I shook it, still processing the fact that someone in this building actually knew who I was. "Should I know your name?" "Probably not. I'm retired now. Spent 40 years in investment banking. I know your brother's type." He chuckled softly, then looked back through the glass at Julian, who was still working the room with that frantic, too bright smile. "I also know his company," Warren added, his voice dropping an octave. My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Your brother is in significant trouble, June. His firm is under federal investigation. Securities fraud. The merger he's celebrating tonight isn't a promotion, it's an escape hatch. He's trying to jump ship before the whole thing goes public and the indictments start flying." I felt the ground shift beneath my heels. That can't be right. Julian is the golden boy. The success story. Warren's expression was kind but deadly serious. "The investigation has been active for 8 months. I still have friends in the industry. The firm he's joining is essentially buying his silence, but they don't know what I know." He paused, his gaze shifting to my father, who was still sitting alone by the window. "And I'm guessing they don't know what you know, either." "What I know?" Your father looks worried. Confused. Has Julian been assisting him with his finances lately? The crack inside me widened. "How could you possibly know that?" "I didn't. But I've seen this pattern before. When men like that get desperate, they take from the people who trust them most." I stared at my father through the glass. He had mentioned money being tight recently, but I'd assumed it was just the economy or perhaps some poorly timed investments. What if it was something far more sinister? Warren handed me a heavy, cream-colored business card. "I think you should look into this quietly. And if you find what I suspect you'll find, you should know that your brother's house of cards is about to collapse. The only question is who else gets buried in the rubble." He left me standing there on my own terrace, surrounded by the proof of my own success, with the sudden, cold certainty that everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. Julian wasn't the success story. He was a con man. And my father was likely his primary victim. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, with Warren Beckford's card on my nightstand like a ticking bomb. Federal investigation. Securities fraud. The words echoed in my mind like thunder. Part of me wanted to believe it was a mistake. Julian was arrogant. Yes. He was a world-class jerk who had just humiliated me in front of 200 people. But a criminal? Then I remembered my father's face. The confusion. The way his suit hung loose on his frame. The way my mother snapped at him as if he were a child. I've always had good instincts. You don't survive in the construction industry without learning to trust your gut. When a contractor is lying about materials, you feel it. When a client is hiding a budget crisis, you sense it. My body was screaming that something was very, very wrong. At 6 a.m., I gave up on sleep and did what I always do when I need to clear my head. I drove to a job site. We were in the middle of a complex Zen-style installation for a tech executive in the foothills of the Rockies. Watching the crew move with such quiet precision always grounds me. I sat in my truck, a 10-year-old Chevy Silverado with 200,000 miles on the odometer and a permanent dent in the tailgate from the time my foreman backed into a granite boulder. I love that truck. It's paid for, it runs like a clock, and unlike certain members of my family, it doesn't care how much money I make. The morning sun began to bleed over the horizon, and I made my choice. I was going to find the truth. I called Warren Beckford. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he'd been expecting the call. I asked for the unvarnished reality of the investigation into Julian's firm. We spoke for 45 minutes. Warren was careful, sticking to what was technically public knowledge in high finance circles, but the picture he painted was devastating. Julian's firm had been cooking the books for years, inflating returns, hiding losses, and shuffling capital to cover the gaps. The SEC had been building a case for nearly a year. Julian wasn't just facing a career setback, he was looking at potential criminal indictments. I don't have the full picture on his personal affairs, Warren said, his voice grave. But I know the pattern. June. When men like your brother feel the walls closing in, they look for lifeboats. And usually, those lifeboats belong to the people who trust them most. People like your father. I thanked him and hung up, sitting in the cab of my truck for another 20 minutes, watching my crew move boulders into position. I didn't build a $12 million company by accident. I built it by being methodical, patient, and incredibly thorough. When I take on a project, I plan for every contingency. When I face a problem, I gather every scrap of data before I strike. Julian had spent his entire life underestimating me, assuming I was just the simple sister who got lucky. He had no idea what was coming. Step 1 was reconnaissance. I called my father that afternoon, keeping my tone casual and light. Hey, Dad. Just checking in. How's the garden looking? The conversation started normally enough. He talked about his tomatoes and the weather, but when I pivoted to his recent meeting with his financial advisor, his voice shifted. It became smaller, more distant. Oh, Julian's handling all of that now, he said. He told me it would be much easier if he managed everything under one roof. Something about maximizing the returns. I felt a cold chill settle in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. That's generous of him. So, he has access to your accounts now? He has power of attorney, June, Dad said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Your mother insisted. She said I was getting too old to handle the complicated stuffy anymore. Power of attorney. My 38-year-old brother had total control over our 72-year-old father's life savings, and no one had seen fit to mention it to me. I ended the call with a cheerful goodbye and immediately dialed Sarah Jenkins. Sarah has been my corporate attorney for 8 years. She's handled everything from contract disputes to labor laws, and she's the sharpest mind I know when it comes to protecting assets. I laid out my suspicions, and the line went silent for a long beat. June, if what you're telling me is true, we're looking at elder financial abuse, she said. That is a serious felony. You have to be very careful here. If you're wrong, you'll destroy your relationship with your family permanently. But if you're right... She paused, her tone turning clinical. If you're right, your brother could go to prison. I'm aware, I replied. Sarah recommended a private investigator she'd worked with on white-collar cases, a man named Elias Thorne who specialized in forensic accounting. I called him within the hour. Elias was blunt, direct, and entirely unimpressed by the family drama. Just give me the names, the entities, and whatever account info you can scrape up, he said. Save the soap opera for the holidays. I'll have a preliminary report for you in 2 weeks. He warned me that I might not like what he found. I told him I was prepared for the worst, but as the days ticked by, I realized that was a lie. No one is ever truly prepared to find out that their own blood has been bleeding them dry. While Elias dug into the digital paper trail, I started my own investigation. I called the county assessor's office and discovered a fresh lien on my father's house, filed just 6 months ago. My father had lived in that home for 35 years. He'd owned it free and clear since I was a teenager. Now, suddenly, it was collateral for a $200,000 loan. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. I also looked into the firm Julian was supposedly merging with. They were a prestigious outfit, known for being obsessively cautious. They performed exhaustive due diligence, background checks, deep dive audits, the works. This meant one of two things. Either they hadn't finished their homework on Julian yet, or someone had fed them a very polished, very fake set of books. Warren had mentioned he still had contacts in the industry. I began to wonder exactly how much gravity a retired banking titan could still exert. 3 days after the gala, I drove out to see my parents. I wasn't there to confront them, not yet. I needed to see my father with my own eyes. What I found made my blood run cold. He was significantly worse than he'd appeared at the party. He was struggling with basic details, what day of the week it was, whether he'd had lunch. My mother spent the entire visit talking over him, treating him like a ghost in his own living room. I managed to catch him alone for a few minutes while she was in the kitchen. I asked him directly about his savings. His eyes went cloudy, drifting toward the window. I don't really know, honey. Julian says everything is fine. He's taking care of the details. Do you know how much is left in your retirement fund, Dad? Or even which bank holds the accounts? He couldn't answer. He didn't know. Julian takes care of it, he repeated, almost like a mantra. Julian knows what he's doing. I left their house that afternoon with tears stinging my eyes and a cold, sharp fury in my heart. My brother had weaponized our father's trust. He had seen a man's fading mind not as a tragedy to be protected, but as an opportunity to be exploited. Julian had built a career on looking important while others did the heavy lifting. Now, he was building his escape fund out of our father's life's work. 2 weeks later, Elias Thorne called with the final report. The reality was grimmer than my worst-case scenario. Over the last 2 years, Julian had siphoned $340,000 from Dad's accounts into his own. He'd tricked Dad into signing the home equity loan. He'd even cashed out a life insurance policy intended for my mother. Total theft, over $500,000. My father had spent 40 years as an electrician. He'd worked in crawl spaces and on high-voltage lines, saving every penny to ensure he and Mom would be safe in their old age. And Julian had gutted it all. I sat in my office, Thorne's report heavy in my hands, looking out at the company I had built from the ground up. 50 employees depended on me. I had millions in active contracts and a reputation built on sweat and integrity. Julian had never worked a day like that in his life. He had only ever taken. But the taking was over. I called Sarah. I called Warren. Then I called a contact I'd made years ago during a government contract, Marcus Reed, an investigator with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Julian thought he was the smartest person in the family. He was about to find out how wrong he was. The next 3 weeks were the most focused of my life. I've managed 20 simultaneous construction sites during a labor strike, but this was different. I turned my home office into a war room. Elias's report, bank statements, property records, and a detailed timeline of Julian's fraud covered the walls. It looked like a revenge-themed gallery. My cat, Mochi, was deeply concerned. She kept sitting on the most incriminating documents, meowing as if trying to stage an intervention. But Mochi doesn't understand the nuances of interstate wire fraud, so I had to ignore her professional opinion. Marcus Reed was more helpful, if less cuddly. When I presented him with the evidence, there was a long, heavy silence on the line. "Ms. Miller," he said eventually. "You realize that what you're describing is a separate felony from the securities case we're building? Securities fraud is one thing, but systematic theft from a vulnerable senior, that's elder financial abuse." Marcus asked for every scrap of paper I had. I sent it all, the PI's findings, the bank records, the liens. He promised a personal review. 6 days later, he called back. "We are very interested in pursuing this. The elder abuse charges are state level, but given the overlap with our federal case, we can coordinate. However, we have to be surgical. Your brother is already a person of interest. If he gets spooked and runs, we lose the whole board. What do you need from me?" Marcus explained that the FBI had been tracking Julian's firm for months. They had evidence of falsified reports and misappropriated client funds, but they needed to time the arrests perfectly to prevent the destruction of evidence. "We need a controlled environment," Marcus said. "Somewhere we know he'll be." That's when I remembered Julian's next big move. He was planning a formal family dinner at a high-end restaurant to finalize the merger with his new partners. "What if I told you exactly where he'll be?" I said. "On a specific night, surrounded by the very people he's trying to impress." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Tell me more." Over the next 2 weeks, I became the world's most supportive sister. I called Julian to congratulate him on the merger. I sent Vanessa a bouquet of white lilies with a note saying how thrilled I was for them both. I even called my mother and suggested we all get together to celebrate Julian's success properly. Martha was suspicious at first. "Since when do you take an interest in Julian's career?" "I've been thinking about what you said," I told her, the words nearly sticking in my throat. "About being more supportive, about appreciating everything Julian has accomplished. I want to try harder, Mom." She practically melted through the phone. "Oh, June, that is so mature of you. Julian will be so pleased." Julian was indeed pleased. He was so pleased that he called me himself, something that hadn't happened in nearly 3 years. "June, this is great," he said. "Really great. I'm glad you're finally coming around. This dinner is going to be high stakes. My new partners will be there, and I need the family to make a stellar impression. I'll be on my best behavior, I promised." What I didn't mention was that Warren Beckford would also be attending. I'd called him the day after Marcus Reed and I finalized our plan. Warren had been more than happy to help. "I've been waiting 40 years to watch a man like your brother get exactly what's coming to him," Warren said. "Consider me your +1. Warren also made a few strategic phone calls to his old contacts at the firm Julian was joining. He didn't reveal the whole truth, just enough to make them nervous, just enough to make them start asking the kind of questions that lead to audits. He wanted to ensure that when the hammer finally dropped, they would already be looking for the exits. The restaurant Julian chose was called the Silver Oak. White linen, overpriced steaks, and the kind of atmosphere where the waiters judge you for your choice of wine. I had actually done some pro bono landscaping consultation for them 2 years ago. They had a stunning patio garden that I designed in exchange for a lifetime discount on their seller list. Life is about making strategic investments. I coordinated the timing with Marcus. The FBI would have agents in plain clothes positioned throughout the dining room. They wouldn't make a scene. This wasn't a Hollywood movie. They would wait for my signal, then approach Julian quietly and ask him to step outside. Professional. Controlled. Devastating. But first, I had one final piece of preparation. I spent an entire weekend with my accountant reviewing my finances. My company was valued at $12 million. My personal savings, investments, and property totaled another $3 million. By any reasonable metric, I was wealthy. I had never felt wealthy. I still drove my old truck, still wore work boots most days, and still had dirt under my fingernails more often than not. Money had never been the point for me. Building something was the point, creating something beautiful out of raw materials and stubborn determination. But money was about to matter very much, because I was going to use mine to fix everything Julian had broken. I set up a trust fund for my father's long-term care. I arranged to pay off the fraudulent lien on his house in full. I contacted an elder law attorney about establishing a proper guardianship to ensure no one could ever exploit him again. When this was over, Dad would be protected, Mom would be taken care of, and Julian would finally face the consequences of his choices. The night before the dinner, my phone rang. It was Julian. His voice sounded different, strained, thin, almost desperate. "June, I need to ask you something, and I need you to just listen without asking questions." "What is it, Julian?" "I need to borrow some cash. Just 50,000. I'll pay you back within a month. I swear on my life." I kept my voice neutral despite the racing of my heart. $50,000? Julian, that's a lot of money. I know. But I'm in a tight spot. Some investments didn't pan out exactly the way I expected. It's temporary. The merger is going to solve everything. I just need to get through the next few weeks. He was terrified. I could hear it in the tremor of his voice. The golden boy was finally realizing that his house of cards was swaying in the wind. "That's a very large request, Julian. I'm not sure I have that kind of liquidity just lying around." "Come on, June. I know you've done okay with your little business. You must have something saved up." Even now, even when he was begging me for a lifeline, he couldn't help being condescending. "Let me think about it," I said. We can talk more at dinner tomorrow. He thanked me profusely, which was a first. Julian had never thanked me for anything in his life. I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness of my living room, Mochi purring on my lap. Tomorrow, everything would change. Julian thought he was getting a supportive family dinner and a $50,000 loan from his simple sister. What he was actually getting was the end of every lie he had ever told. I scratched Mochi behind her ears. You know what, Kat? Revenge really is a dish best served at a restaurant where I have a lifetime discount. Mochi didn't respond. She's always been more of a listener. He was terrified. I could hear the thin, brittle edge in his voice, the sound of a man realizing his house of cards was finally caught in a gale. I pretended to weigh his request. That's a significant amount of capital, Julian. I'm not sure I have that kind of cash sitting in a checking account. Oh, come on, June. I know you've done well enough with your little business. You must have something tucked away. Your little business. Even now, while he was effectively begging me for a lifeline, he couldn't suppress the urge to be condescending. Let me think on it, I said. We can discuss it after the dinner tomorrow. He thanked me with a fawning sincerity that felt entirely alien coming from him. Julian had never thanked me for anything in his life. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my living room, Mochi's rhythmic purring the only sound in the house. Tomorrow, everything would shift. Julian expected a supportive family gathering and a $50,000 bailout from the sister he looked down upon. What he was actually walking into was the total liquidation of every lie he had ever told. I scratched Mochi behind her ears. You know, Kat? Revenge really is a dish best served at a restaurant where I have a lifetime discount. The silver oak was radiant that evening. Soft, amber lighting, fresh-cut lilies on every table, and the low, expensive hum of elite conversation. I had chosen my best dress, a simple, structured navy number I'd bought for an awards gala 2 years ago. I wore heels that didn't pinch and actual jewelry. Julian didn't even look at me. June, there you are, he said the moment I arrived, his eyes already darting past me to see if someone more influential had entered. You look fine. Listen, have you had a chance to think about what we discussed? We can talk later, Julian. Let's not make the evening about money before we've even ordered. He practically vibrated with frustrated energy, but he forced a tight smile. Right. Right. Family first. The private dining room was already filling up. Julian's new partners, Richard and Sandra, were there, 2 polished executives who looked as if they'd been engineered in a laboratory for maximum corporate neutrality. Vanessa was glittering in a gown that likely cost more than my first year's gross revenue. My mother looked regal and distant, and my father looked confused but genuinely happy to be out of the house. And then there was Todd. Of course, Todd was there, still trailing in Julian's wake, still sporting that unfortunate, high-definition hairline. He made a beeline for me immediately. June, where? You clean up remarkably well. I almost didn't recognize you without the topsail. Thanks, Todd. I almost didn't recognize you with the hair. He touched his forehead self-consciously. It's a new procedure. Very cutting edge. It's certainly something, I agreed. Warren Beckford arrived precisely on schedule, looking every bit the elder statesman of the financial world in a charcoal wool suit. When Richard and Sandra saw him, their eyes widened. Warren Beckford? Richard said, his voice dropping an octave in reverence. I had no idea you'd be joining us. Warren smiled with practiced, effortless charm. I'm an old friend of the Miller family. June was kind enough to invite me as her guest. Julian's face cycled through several shades of pale in rapid succession. He hadn't known I was even aware of Warren's existence, let alone that I could summon industry royalty to his dinner. That's fantastic, Julian stammered. The more the merrier. We took our seats. The wine was poured, a vintage I'd personally recommended to the house sommelier, and the appetizers arrived. Julian stood to deliver his toast. Thank you all for being here, he began, that familiar, smug mask firmly back in place. This merger represents the culmination of everything I've worked for. It's a new chapter, a testament to the fact that hard work and strategic thinking always prevail. He gestured broadly around the table. I'm surrounded by those who matter most. My beautiful wife, my mother, and my new partners who I know will lead us to unparalleled heights. He paused, his gaze landing on me with a flicker of the old disdain. And even my sister, who is finally learning what real success looks like. Some of us work with our hands, and some of us work with our minds. I've always believed the mind is the far more valuable tool. A few people offered polite, hollow laughter. My mother beamed. Vanessa smirked. Todd actually winked at me. I sat there, serenely sipping my wine, watching the tremor in Julian's hands that he couldn't quite hide. Richard and Sandra were exchanging subtle, uneasy glances. Warren was watching the entire performance with the patient detachment of a man who had seen many empires rise and fall. Finally, Julian raised his glass. To the future. To the future, the table echoed. That was when Warren Beckford cleared his throat and stood up slowly. Before we drink to that, he said, his voice calm and resonant, I think there's something your new partners should see. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a heavy manila folder, and slid it across the white linen toward Richard and Sandra. Julian went bone-white. What is this? Warren, what are you doing? Warren's voice remained calm, almost conversational. It's the result of a preliminary audit. Something your new partners requested quietly last week after I suggested they might want to take a closer look at the internal ledgers. Richard opened the folder. His expression shifted from curiosity to pure horror in a matter of seconds. Julian, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. What exactly is this? These figures don't even resemble the ones you presented in the prospectus. It's a mistake, Julian said, his voice climbing an octave. Those are old numbers. Projections. The current situation is completely different. I can explain. Sandra was already reading over Richard's shoulder, her face hardening. This shows systematic falsification of records going back 3 years, Julian. There are SEC violations on nearly every page. The room fell into a deafening silence. Every eye at the table was fixed on Julian. Then, his phone began to vibrate against the tablecloth. He snatched it up like a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. Hello. His face drained of whatever color was left. What do you mean? They're at the house? What warrant? He looked up, his eyes wild and unfocused. That was when he noticed the two people who had quietly stepped into the private dining room. A man and a woman, dressed in the kind of sharp, nondescript suits that practically screamed federal law enforcement. Julian Miller? The man asked. I'm Agent Reed with the FBI. We have some questions for you regarding securities fraud and the misappropriation of client funds. We'd like you to come with us. Julian's mouth worked soundlessly, like a fish out of water. This is insane. I haven't done anything wrong. This is a misunderstanding. The female agent stepped forward, producing a document. We also have a warrant related to elder financial abuse, specifically the unauthorized transfer of funds from the accounts of Arthur Miller, your father. My father looked up at the sound of his name, his brow furrowed in confusion. What? Julian? What's happening? My mother's face was a frozen mask of shock. Vanessa sat perfectly still, her champagne glass suspended halfway to her lips as if she turned to stone. Julian turned to me, his eyes blazing with a sudden, venomous clarity. You did this. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress. No, Julian. You did this. I just made sure everyone saw it. I addressed the table, my voice steady and clear. My brother has siphoned over $340,000 from our father's retirement accounts over the last 2 years. He took out a predatory loan against my parents' home without my father's informed consent. He exploited our father's trust and his declining health to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford while his firm was collapsing under the weight of his own fraud. I looked at Richard and Sandra. Your merger would have made you accessories to his crimes. Warren did you a favor. I looked at my mother. You put him in charge of everything because you thought he was the success story. You thought I was just their simple sister with no real career. Finally, I looked Julian in the eye. I own a corporation worth $12 million. I have 50 employees. I just signed a $5 million contract with the city. I've been featured in Architectural Digest and won a National Design Award. And I never told you because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not for what I'm worth. The room was absolutely silent. But you couldn't do that, I continued. You humiliated me. You dismissed me. And worst of all, you stole from a man who spent 40 years working in crawlspaces and attics to give us a good life. Julian's face finally crumpled. June, please. You have to help me. Tell them this is a mistake. Talk to them. Agent Reed stepped forward, placing a hand on Julian's shoulder. Sir, we need to go. Now. As they led Julian out of the dining room, he looked back at me one last time. The mask of the golden child was gone. He just looked small, terrified, and utterly pathetic. I felt no triumph, no surge of satisfaction, only a deep, weary sadness. But beneath that was relief. After 34 years, the truth was finally out in the light. Vanessa stood up so abruptly she nearly toppled her chair. She was already dialing a number on her phone as she headed for the door. I need a lawyer, she was saying. And a divorce attorney. Now. Todd sat frozen, his mouth hanging open. He had almost tied his money, and his reputation, to a federal criminal. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. You really own a $12 million company? Goodbye, Todd. I walked over to my father and took his hand. He looked up at me, tears welling in his eyes. June, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I trusted him. I know, Dad. It's not your fault. I'm going to take care of everything now. He squeezed my hand. You were always the good one. I should have seen it. We sat there together while the chaos swirled around us. My mother was weeping quietly into a silk napkin. Richard and Sandra were making frantic calls to their legal teams. Warren was calmly finishing his wine, the air of a man who had seen the righteous end of a long story. Outside, Julian was being helped into an unmarked sedan. His career, his reputation, his marriage, everything he had built on a foundation of lies was gone. 1 month later, I stood on a construction site in the cool mountain air of the early morning. I watched my crew install the final limestone water feature for the riverfront project. The air smelled of wet stone and fresh earth. My boots were caked in mud, my hands were rough, and I had never felt more like myself. Julian's arrest had made the local papers, though I'd ignored every request for an interview. The federal charges were moving forward alongside the state's case for elder abuse. His assets were frozen, and his firm had shuttered its doors for good. Vanessa had filed for divorce within 48 hours. The money Julian stole was tied up in legal proceedings, but I didn't wait for the courts. I paid off the lien on my parents' house immediately. I established a trust for my father's care with my own funds and hired a professional caregiver to help my mother. Dad's health was still a challenge, but he was doing better now that the fog of financial stress had lifted. He spent his afternoons in the garden, and our weekly phone calls were the highlight of my life. My mother and I had a difficult conversation a few days after the dinner. She didn't apologize, that isn't in her nature, but she did admit she had been blind. "I never understood what you did," she told me. "It just looked like you were playing in the dirt." Julian spoke a language I understood. Titles, suits, numbers. I should have looked closer. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning. Warren Beckford and I have lunch once a week now. He's become a mentor, introducing me to clients who actually value the art of what I do. He says watching Julian's downfall was the best retirement gift he could have asked for. He has a dark sense of humor. I've grown to appreciate that. My phone buzzed, a text from my foreman. The water feature was ready for its first test. I walked over to the control panel and flipped the switch. Water surged upward in perfect, shimmering arcs, catching the morning light and creating a spray of tiny rainbows in the mist. My crew cheered, and a few of them clapped me on the back. This was what I had built. Not just gardens, but a legacy of integrity. Beauty created from raw earth and hard work. Julian had spent his life shuffling numbers on a screen, building nothing and helping no one. In the end, he had lost it all. I had spent mine with my hands in the soil, and in the end, I had everything that mattered. My phone rang, a new client wanting to discuss a multi-million-dollar commercial project. I looked down at my muddy boots and smiled. "This is June Miller. How can I help you?" My boots were caked in mud, my hands were rough, and I had never felt more like myself. Julian's arrest had dominated the local business news for a week, though I had refused every request for an interview. The federal charges for securities fraud were moving forward in tandem with the state's case for elder financial abuse. His assets were frozen, his reputation was in tatters, and his former firm had collapsed entirely. The merger, of course, was dead on arrival. Vanessa had filed for divorce 48 hours after the dinner. I heard through the grapevine that she was already seeing one of her high-priced attorneys. Some people truly do have a talent for landing on their feet, regardless of the wreckage they leave behind. Todd had called me several times, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails about how he always believed in my vision and suggesting we grab coffee to discuss potential synergies. I deleted the messages without listening to the end. Some bridges aren't worth rebuilding. They are far more beautiful when you watch them burn from a safe distance with a glass of good wine in your hand. The money Julian had siphoned from my father was being tracked through the legal system, but I didn't wait for the courts to finish their work. I paid off the fraudulent lien on my parents' house immediately. I established a private trust for my father's care using my own capital and hired a professional caregiver to assist my mother with his daily needs. Dad's cognitive decline was a reality we had to face, but he seemed significantly better now that the crushing weight of financial confusion had been lifted. He spent most of his days in the backyard, puttering around his tomato plants and calling me to chat about the weather or the birds. Those calls were the undisputed highlight of my week. My mother and I finally had a real conversation a few days after the fallout. She didn't offer a traditional apology, that wasn't her style, but she said something that caught me off guard. "I never understood what it was you actually did," she admitted, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "To me, it just looked like you were playing in the dirt." Julian, or he explained things in a language I could grasp. Titles, corporate structures, things that sounded impressive. She paused, looking out at the garden. "I should have asked you more questions, June. I should have looked closer." It wasn't total forgiveness, but it was a foundation. Warren Beckford and I began meeting for lunch once a week. He had stepped into the role of a mentor, offering sharp business insights and introducing me to a network of developers who valued integrity as much as design. He often remarked that watching Julian's house of cards collapse was the most entertainment he'd had since his retirement. The man had a dark sense of humor, and I found I appreciated it more every day. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my foreman. The riverfront water feature was ready for its final pressure test. I walked over to the main control panel and flipped the heavy industrial switch. Water surged upward in perfect, shimmering arcs, catching the high Colorado sun and fracturing the light into 1,000 tiny rainbows in the mist. My crew broke into cheers, and a few of them clapped me on the shoulder. This was what I had built. Not just fountains and stone paths, but a legacy of trust. I had created spaces that would endure for decades, built from raw materials, hard work, and a stubborn refusal to be broken. Julian had spent his career shuffling numbers on a screen, creating nothing, helping no one, and ultimately losing everything. I had spent mine with my hands in the earth, creating beauty that people could actually touch. In the end, I was the one who had everything that mattered. My phone rang. A new client reached out to discuss a multi-million-dollar commercial project downtown. I looked down at my muddy boots, my calloused palms, and my team celebrating another hard-won victory. Some people spend so much time looking down on others that they never notice the ground beneath them has turned to quicksand. I answered the call with a smile. "This is June Miller. How can I help you?"